Hi guys, welcome back to another video on my channel. So today's video is going to be another art doll making video. Finally got one up. So if you haven't already seen my previous video on how I sculpted this head, check it out. It's on my YouTube. I'll try and remember to link it, but I never do remember how to link things. But I do have a sculpting video on my channel on how I sculpted this head if you want to know the sculpting process. So for this one, this is a commission from a previous customer before. They have a few of my dolls and they wanted one of their late cat that they that passed away a little while ago, and sent me some photos. So memorial animals are always pretty difficult to do because there's like an expectation of obviously it looking exactly like the animal, but it's always really difficult to get things exactly the same. And because the owner knows exactly what that animal looks like, it's always a difficult one to do memorial animals. But basically at the start I was painting all the areas that are going to be visible, so all of the bits on the polymer clay that aren't going to be covered in faux fur. Painted it in a water-based acrylic paint, nothing special. Let that dry. There's no painting of the feet because I did the feet from polymer clay and added like the little bits and pieces of the markings that are on the little toe beans of the cat. And you saw me making the armature. I have a couple of armature videos over on my Patreon if you want to know a little bit more detail about those ball and socket armatures and how I make them. There's a couple of different dolls on there which I show you the armatures that I made. I also do a sort of another technique that takes a little bit of time, which is needle felting the body with some polyfill. I think it turns out better than my previous method, but I think my previous method was still pretty good. It's more like a plushy sort of method, but this one is a lot more work, so it involves a lot more time to make the actual body and put it all together. But I think the payoff is worth it in the end. So basically once I've sculpted that body with the polyfill, it's sort of, I say sculpting because it's sort of sculpting like muscle tone out of the polyfill, out of needle felting, and it gives it a little bit more detailing than what you would normally get with the other technique that I used to do. So once I'm happy with that polyfill, the way that's looking and the muscle tone and everything, I can start adding the faux fur skin, as I call it. And basically I start off with the torso piece and sort of refine that to the point where I'm happy with, and then I can start working on all of the extremities. So that includes the tail, both legs, or both sets of legs, the neck area as well. And for this particular doll, it had specific patterning for, because it was someone's pet, it had specific patternings on their bodies. So it was mostly black and white, with mostly black for the whole doll, with just little white bits and pieces. So I did a little bit of thinking and trial and error. I've done these sorts of techniques before with some dolls that I made for the Calgary Zoo, and I think it worked really well, and it sort of achieved the patternings that I liked and that were needed. So before I do any of the patterning, I decided to go with doing all the black stuff first because most of the body was black. So anything that I sew, I use a ladder stitch, and I always get a good quality thread as well because you need to pull it quite tight. So if you've got a cheap thread, it tends to sort of snap and tangle easily. So I use a Gutermann thread. It's a little bit more expensive, but I think the payoff is worth it. You can also get some upholstery thread, which I use for things that need like a lot of tension, because you're not snapping that thread. It's really, really thick, and it's super strong, and you can pull the thread really tight and it will close the seams really tightly as well. So, but this one wasn't really needed. I just used the Gutermann thread, and it still tangles sometimes, so you sort of have to be careful and make sure when you're pulling the thread through that you don't sort of get it tangled in the process, because it gets tangled really, really easily in that pile of the faux fur. So I always make sure I have a nice clean string when I'm pulling it through. Doesn't always work though, so So the back legs had like a little bit of a white patch on the bottom of it, so I sort of left that off the black bit and then added it after I've done mostly all the black stuff. The tail is usually the last bit that I sew, just to make sure everything's looking good and I still have an opening to put any polyfill that needs to be put in, and just anything else that needs to be done. And once I'm happy with that, I can start gluing all the pieces down. So I usually start with the neck area, and I use a tacky fabric glue. It's nothing special, but it adheres really well to resins and polymer clay. And then I also do that for the feet as well, to make sure they're nice and sturdy, and I'll usually leave it overnight to make sure everything's dry and adhered properly. So moving on to the patches. So the patches, the first one that I'm starting with here is around the neck. There was like a little white patch around the neck and then like a little black chin. So basically what I did was pin the shape, the correct shape of the pattern on the chest, and then I'm gluing this first bit to the polymer clay head. And I don't normally glue things to the actual faux fur, but because this is going on to the polymer clay, I'm gluing this down just to begin with, and then I can sew around it afterwards, and make sure like it's got a nice sturdy holding. And so I'll wait for this to dry before I move on to anything else in that area, so I can start sewing once it's dry. There's also a little white patch underneath the back legs, so I basically just sewed on a little patch that same shape using a lattice stitch. I waited. I didn't trim anything either. I think that works better when you're working with patches, is to trim everything when it's all been done. That way you can achieve like a nice the pile flows a little bit better, rather than just trimming it short all at once at the first and then adding the patches, and then you got like this long bit. It doesn't really work that way, so I always recommend trimming afterwards. And then underneath the belly area, there's like this really unusual sort of U-shaped pattern out of white, and it was really, really thin, so I didn't want to go ahead and sew a really, really thin piece because it doesn't really work that well. So I had an idea of just sort of combining needle felting into the process just to achieve like that pattern, and it was really specific pattern, so it was hard to get it completely right. I hope I did. But yeah, it took a little bit of time to do this and get the patterning right, but I think it turned out really well. And I just sort of secure it with a tiny glue dot and sort of push it through to the backing of the faux fur, so it's not too much of an intrusion on any of the faux fur. But I think this technique worked really well, especially when you're doing like really thin patterns. I've done it a couple of times before, and I think it just works really well for small patterns like this. So once that's done, I'm just leaving everything to dry to begin with, and then I can give it an overall trim. I usually do like a preliminary trim before I add anything that I need to add, but not like the full-on trim version. So when I add the faux fur to the head and the feet, then I'll give it like a proper trim and make sure everything's sort of unison with the length of the faux fur. A little bit of cleanup on the head when you apply some faux fur, especially around that mouth area, the nose and the eye area. A little bit of sort of repainting and refining around the eye area as well. Sometimes the faux fur gets in places where it's not supposed to, so you got to pick it out. And yes, just little bits and pieces of the detailing. So I thought I'd add this to the end of the video as well, just to show you how I sort of fix things. So the customer wanted the neck to be a little bit shorter, and it's really a kind of a quick fix in this particular doll. There's obviously solutions for every individual doll, but for this one, basically what I did was I opened that seam up around the neck area, and because I only did the neck area as one piece, there's a seam on the back of the head, on the back of the neck, that I could unpick. And I basically just unpicked that bit and removed some of that polyfill, and I removed 2 segments of this ball and socket armature. So that's sort of the beauty with using ball and socket armatures, is you can remove pieces and just stick them back together, whereas if you're using a wire armature, you're sort of a bit harder to do that sort of thing. You sort of got to take the head off the end of the armature, trim that, and reattach it. So having the ball and socket armature really saves time. And once that's done, so I shortened it just a tiny bit, not too much, I just re-add that polyfill and sew it back up. So it's kind of a simple solution. Just takes a little bit more time, but yeah, really simple when you're using ball and socket armature as well. So I'll probably leave it there. If any questions, leave it in the comments. Thanks for watching for this one. Give it a thumbs up and don't forget to comment and all that stuff. If you're interested in commissions, don't forget to just send me a message with your idea and we can talk about something, what you're thinking of. And I do have payment plans available as well, so just ask, and that goes for anything in my shop. Thank you to my patrons for supporting me. I really appreciate it. You can check out my Patreon if you want some more bits and pieces, including printables and discounts for my shop. You can also find me on Twitter. Twitter? I don't use Twitter, really. I have a Twitter, but I don't use it. TikTok, I was meant to say. TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram as well. And my shop, creaturenut.com, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye!